That was the week. We are back, April the 16th. And it seems to have been, at least in many people's minds, a historic week in tech, or a week where crypto has finally arrived. Coinbase's much publicized, much heralded IPO. So, Keith, is April 16th, the week of April 16th, 2021, when we get to write, or when somebody writes the history of crypto? Is the Coinbase IPO going to be seen as a milestone, or is it just more froth in the crypto mania?
Well, before that, Andrew, let's just acknowledge that this is our faux pas moment, because according to the graphics, you are Keith Tier and I am Andrew Keene.
Well, that's fantasy land now.
It means we have to use a different one. Maybe we'll use this one.
I think we all know. Everyone knows who we are.
Of course they do. So, and Andrew, it's a big deal, actually. Coinbase going public it's symbolic of blockchain and crypto coming inside the tent. It's a little bit like that moment when the music industry signed the first rap band. And from being street music, rap turned into mainstream music. What's happened here is that Wall Street has embraced Coinbase. It's valued today at nearly $70 billion. And
it wasn't an astonishing. It wasn't a Netscape style IPO. It wasn't particularly successvel, though, was it? I mean, they came in lower than the end of the day. They were worth less than they were at the beginning of the day.
Well, it's a bit different because it was doing what Bill Gurley loves, which is a direct listing. And with a direct listing, so I'll give you the parameters. Prior to the listing, on the secondary markets where you can buy shares of private companies, people were selling shares for about $370. The New York Stock Exchange decided to initially indicate a $250 price on the direct listing. It's just an indication.
Yeah.
When the stock opened, it opened at 381.
Yeah.
It went all the way up to 429 and then settled back $100 lower.
Okay, but let's step back, Keith. You're very good at historical perspectives. What does this actually mean?
It means that blockchain and crypto are now a legitimate investment asset class looked at from the point of view of Wall Street and the big institutions that buy stocks and shares through Wall Street. So it's basically a legitimization of what was previously thought of as a crazy or revolutionary infrastructure.
So is it the equivalent of the Netscape IPO? Is it the equivalent?
It is.
Of the Amazon IPO or the Google IPO? What does it actually all mean?
It is that symbolic, although again, just to give a historical context there, these days companies build value privately. And by the time they go public, a lot of value has been built. So the 70 billion, 60 billion valuation, that Netscape was way, way, way below that, because in those days you went public early and you built your value afterwards.
And all the money here seems to be made by our friends who need the money, of course, Andreessen Horowitz and my real friends at Union Square Ventures. So the VCs have done very well out of this one.
Yeah, I mean, Andreessen is instrumental. Gary Tan, actually, who's an angel here in the Valley, was the first investor, and he's multiplied his investment, which was $300,000, by 3,000 times.
I don't know whether I should be laughing or crying. And just very simply, Coinbase then is a platform for allowing people to trade in crypto. Is that right?
Yeah, it's very similar to what the NASDAQ is or the New York Stock Exchange is for shares. Coinbase is an exchange where you get an account, you put money in it, and you can buy and sell crypto.
And how does that change from, say, PayPal or Square, who are also in the crypto space? Is Coinbase an addition, a competitor to these pre-existing digital platforms?
It can be. So core Coinbase is an exchange, which the others are not. You can buy things with Bitcoin on PayPal, but Coinbase is trading Bitcoin for Ethereum or for dollars and so on. So it's a little bit different. Now, Coinbase does also have Coinbase for merchants. So you can get a little thing that turns your shopping cart into something that can accept Bitcoin. So they compete with PayPal there. And that's only a small business for them today, but it could become bigger in the future. And there's also all kinds of APIs that Coinbase
And they're a
has.
controversial company. I remember last year, or perhaps the year before, Brian Armstrong's their CEO, founder, banning their employees from talking about politics at work. So not an uncontroversial company.
Well, it's controversial in every sense. Although one of the articles in the newsletter this week, which is fascinating, is Y Combinator's article looking back at the history.
I knew you were going to get Y Combinator in, Keith. You had to mention them, didn't you? Although, did they put the original money into Coinbase?
They did, and it's actually fascinating, Andrew, because Brian Armstrong applied via the Hacker News Group for a co-founder. So Brian, at that time there were only 100,000 Bitcoin wallets.
Yeah.
And so Armstrong's idea for an exchange was very weird. In 2012, it was extremely strange and weird. And Y Combinator, to their credit, backed him, and he found
was it your friend Paul Graham?
It certainly was.
Well, Paul, if you're watching, congratulations! Another successful grasp of the future. The ride is still very bumpy, though. In the future, if you own Coinbase stock, you've got to expect some big ups and downs, don't you? In the future, Keith.
I actually bought 100 shares when it got to the $328 amount at the end of the first day, and I'm not selling them. It will go up and down, but it'll mainly go up.
The equivalent to Amazon, do you think, in 10, 15 years? Is it conceivable? I mean, Armstrong is not in the Bezos class, is he?
Well, neither was Bezos when he was Armstrong's age.
Well, I don't know. It'd be interesting to see. So you think quite highly of Armstrong? You think he's a smart guy?
You just have to be to go through everything he's gone through, including the crash in crypto in 2019 and 18. He must be very strong-willed, very much focused on his end game, a true believer in what he's doing, and also has the ability to lead people who are much older than him in some cases. He has a very strong chief operating officer who, by the way, wrote a piece that's also in this week's newsletter. This is her. She is credited with being very, very important. Emily Choi, very, very important in making the company successful. So it is not only Brian Armstrong, but I think will this be $1 trillion or even a $2 trillion company 10 years from now? You'd have to be pretty brave to bet against that.
Well, they have first mover advantage. And talking of trillion or $2 trillion companies, Amazon is very much in the news. We mentioned Jeff Bezos. I have to admit that I'm perhaps one of his greatest admirers, but also one of his greatest critics. He's clearly a remarkable man. And what he's done at Amazon is astonishing. He wrote this week a farewell letter as CEO to the board in which he's acknowledging some political heat, isn't he, already? I mean, even Bezos recognizes that Amazon has to deal now with the political headwinds given their increasingly problematic reputation, especially when it comes to their treatment of their workers.
Yeah, what did you think of the letter, actually, Andrew? Because you shared it with me last night, and I wasn't originally going to put this in the newsletter, and I read it and decided that you were right, that I should. And
I think it's classic Bezos in that he recognizes he's always been a realist, and he's acknowledging that he has to confront this question of how Amazon treat their workers, particularly given how much personal wealth he has, the richest man in the world now, up to about 180 or 90 billion dollars, perhaps will be the first $1 trillion man.
But what did you think of the
Well, he's trying to suggest that they are creating social value. There's some truth, but as always with Bezos, he's obviously a master at his own spin. I'm not completely convinced, but there's some truth in it. I mean, I don't think it's entirely dismissible. What do you think? Or you haven't?
I use the headline tone deaf to describe it because what he's trying to do in this is respond to the critics who are accusing Amazon of creating bad conditions for its workforce.
Yeah.
And so the whole effort is to show the value that Amazon has created, and it has created a lot of value. And he then tries to apportion that value between employees, shareholders, customers, and himself. And he's trying to make the point that
Yeah,
he's
which
the
is hard to do
smallest.
when he's worth 180 trillion and the average wage of an Amazon worker is $35,000 a year. I mean, he makes $35,000 what, a second, probably more every second now.
So you'd think this would be a moment for him to take the high ground and
But he's
acknowledge.
not that kind of guy. I mean, he's very confrontational. I mean, I remember reading something that there was a joke about now that he's given up being CEO, now he should be really worried because he can concentrate on something else, like colonizing space or something.
Yeah. Yeah, the information had an article saying Jeff Bezos calculates value creation wrongly.
Yeah, I saw that, and I think you put that in the newsletter.
I did, yeah, and I know him a little bit. We used to both go to Esther Dyson's conferences back in the late '90s.
Yeah,
and he's like Brian Armstrong. He is a tenacious, big thinking.
Yeah, I mean, tenacious. There's more extreme than that. I once had a wonderful experience with him in a men's bathroom, which I won't repeat on a family show. But I like him. I mean, I don't like his politics. I don't like really what he's done in terms of workers. I think the biggest worry about him is I think ultimately he's a champion of the broader surveillance economy, because he is a hardcore utilitarian. And
is he amoral? Do you think he's amoral?
I think he's amoral, and I think that doesn't make him immoral, but I think he's trying to squeeze every single last cent of value. And in the end, it's unacceptable. He's not willing to accept any kind of moral element in his business. But the fact that in that letter, Amazon has what, $29 billion of profit. I mean, out of all the companies in the crisis of COVID, Amazon has done the best. I always used to say to my son that you invest in individuals when we were doing the stock market rather than firms. Do you think that Amazon is still a good investment, given that he's going to be doing other things now?
And there was an analyst report this week, which I didn't put in, but it said that it's possible that Amazon is undervalued by as much as 60%, based on what it's likely to do. I do think Amazon's growth is nowhere near the peak. I think the scope.
Well, it'll be interesting. It will be interesting with Amazon versus Apple, where just as Gates has always had this shadow over Microsoft, Bezos clearly will over Amazon, whereas Jobs left the stage, which I think made it a lot easier for Tim Cook to actually reinvent the company and in his own image without having to worry about Jobs criticizing him or getting involved again. So it will be interesting to see Amazon post Bezos versus post Jobs. Let's not just talk about Amazon. Other big companies in the news. Microsoft, still a big company, even if they don't always behave like a big company. What have they been up to this week, Keith?
So Microsoft spent close to $20 billion buying a company called Nuance. Nuance is an old company. It's been around as long as I've been in the Valley, which is almost 25 years.
I remember being at Pulse 3D, and we used to do deals with Nuance back then.
Yeah. So they acquired it. Now, Nuance is the smarts behind interactive voice, and AI applied to voice, trying to understand what somebody means and giving them the right answer and so on. It has lots of patents, and this is in a week where NVIDIA made some announcements about supporting conversational voice in its artificial intelligence models, and it also announced some high performance neural network chips that are coming down the road in 2 to 3 years' time. So, automating voice for a wider range of use cases where decision making is required, that's the core of this. Plus, moving the smarts to the cloud, which both NVIDIA announced a deal with Cloudflare this week, where Cloudflare will be giving access to NVIDIA hardware through its cloud platform. So putting smarts in the cloud, doing more and more with voice, making voice less rules-based and more decision-making based.
But
All of that.
I get all that, and obviously, it seems like it's a real Microsoft deal, a really solid kind of deal, very different from some of the other things they've done, like buying Skype and LinkedIn. But can it make Microsoft a serious player in the AI business, or are they still ultimately the old Microsoft, profiting from that, but never really going to be able to compete in the AI economy?
Well, they're not as advanced as Google with TensorFlow and with DeepMind. So Google clearly is the leader, and a big part of the reason why is because AI needs data. Now, interesting enough, some of these neural network chips coming down the road claim to be able to use something called skeuomorphic, which is they don't need data; they can learn without data.
But that's got nothing to do with Microsoft and Nuance, is it?
I think it does, actually. Nuance's cleverness comes from having passed lots of data historically. And that's where Google's intelligence comes from. And there's actually a hierarchy for our viewers who don't understand. I'll just explain it briefly. There's three kinds of data. There's curated data, where human beings have said what it is and applied metadata, so the machines don't need to figure it out.
Yeah.
Then there's thinly labeled data, which is you label a bit and then the machines can learn what the rest is based on that. And then the next generation is unlabeled data, where there is no human being has touched it, and the machine can still learn the meanings and patterns. So we're somewhere between thinly labeled and unlabeled. And most of these announcements are looking to the next phase as we move to machines being able to act alone without human curation at the front end.
AI, crypto, all things that we're going to talk about endlessly. We already have done, and we certainly will on that was the week as we move forward. We've spoken about some big companies today, Coinbase, of course, Microsoft, Amazon. So let's turn our mind to a small company, a startup, Keith. What's your startup of the week?
Well, this will come as a great shock to everybody, but the startup of the week is Google.
Oh, a real small company. Good choice. Why is Google your startup of the week?
Well, I think the first thing is I actually think of it as a startup. When I first moved to the Valley, I was about a year ahead of Larry and Sergey in doing a company called Real Names, and I partnered with them in their first year. And they used to be in a little office on University Avenue in Palo Alto, and then they moved to another, also quite small office that I used to visit. So in my head, even though it's 20, that was 97. So even though it's not quite 25 years later, it's close. And I think of them as a startup. Secondly, it was announced this week that they're each now worth more than 100 billion, which I think there's only 9 other people in the world that's true of. So I thought it was worth acknowledging a new trend, and the Forbes Midas list bore this out this week, is that a huge chunk of value in the world and wealth is now held by startup founders, a huge amount. More than half the Midas list was made up of startup founders. And this is tech moving from the innovation economy of the mid to late 90s to now being the mainstream economy, which is also what Coinbase
And it's only going to get more with AI, with crypto, with 3D printing, with all these other things. It's only going to get more intense, right?
I think so, yeah. And now TV, of course.
Oh, of course, and now TV, yes. And should we put the Google boys in the same pantheon as Jeff Bezos and Jobs? Are they disappointments ultimately, do you think? Have they not
No,
done that
no, you
much?
couldn't.
I mean,
They both have changed the world for the good.
but
On the
now, I
whole.
mean, Sergey's sort of stepped back. How is Larry Page doing as the
Oh, I
CEO
see. I see.
of
Well,
Alphabet?
so I haven't engaged with either of them, so I'm not going to go on the record and say anything other than
He's
I
the
think
chairman. He's
Sir,
not even the CEO. Is he the CEO of Alphabet or
he is, but Alphabet really isn't an operating company in
it's
that sense.
yeah, it's the
It-
umbrella.
yeah, Sergey is the innovator still in Google X, doing interesting, crazy new stuff, and Larry is, overseeing, like on earnings calls. Larry will be there talking to the analysts, but so will Sundar talking specifically about Google. So I
Is
think
Google the new Microsoft, Keith?
no, Google's got growth in its future still. It won't need to reinvent itself anytime soon. It's fine for the time being, whereas Microsoft has gone through a complete reinvention in the last 10 years.
And they're all, of course, very vulnerable to political stuff. I mean, that's what killed Microsoft, or kind of killed Microsoft. So that's really on the horizon for Google and Amazon, right, Keith? I mean,
Absolutely think that's true. You know what's really interesting is the life of a successful tech company is now longer than the life of some previous industrial companies. If you look at the Dow or the Nasdaq list index, the number of years that these tech companies are in these indexes is now very long. And once they get ahead of the game in fundamental stuff, it's very hard for
yeah.
for a newcomer to dislodge them.
Finally, Keith, we've had a little startup of the week. What about tweet of the week? What's your tweet this week?
Well, it's a bit different than normal, Andrew. This is a sad one. I am an advisor to a company called Cosmos Software, which is the parent company of Millicast, which I mentioned a couple of times in my newsletter. This was led by Alex Gouillard, or Dr. Alex as he's known, who's a really top innovator in internet communications, video, audio, and so on, known as WebRTC. And I'm sad to say that Dr. Alex was killed in a car crash last Thursday. More than a car crash, a serious, a serious accident that instantly killed him in Thailand, which is the home of one of his adopted daughters.
Very sad.
It's very, very sad. And
And I might add, actually, somebody I was very fond of. He's not an A-list lawyer in Silicon Valley, but certainly one of the more respected tech IP lawyers in Silicon Valley. Jeff Capaccio. He always used to come to Futurecast. I know you know him, Keith. He also died suddenly this week in Silicon Valley. He was only 62 years old. And I know that a lot of people in the Valley, a lot of the tech community are very sad to lose Jeff. A delightful man, friendly, a wonderful ambassador for Italy and for America. And he's really going to be missed. And it underlines how little time we actually have in the world and how we should enjoy ourselves while we can.
Yep, fully agree. Dr. Alex was French and lived in Asia most of his adult life. He's in his 40s still, by the way, and had 7 adopted children.
Wow.
Because he was a good person who wanted to
Very
help
sad.
people.
Yeah.
Spoke fluent Japanese. He was just an amazing character. And literally, if you get the newsletter and you click on the tweet, you'll see hundreds of top technical people, remembering his contribution.
Well, in the year of COVID, there's been too much death. So that was the week, a week of historic changes, perhaps in tech with the Coinbase IPO. Lots of interesting developments in AI, some sad news on Keith's personal front. We'll be back next week with lots more stories about crypto and even perhaps Paul Graham. Thank you again, Keith.
Thank you.